What's an order? An order is the system that's operating. How do you operate? So, for example, there is a domestic order. We have constitution and democracy, and that's a system that operates, and that continues on until there's a war, and then there's another system that comes and replaces. Our system has lasted for a long time. There's also a world order, in other words, a world system, and that world system of operating comes after a war. Why does a war happen? Because conflicting parties of about equal power have a fight, and the dominant power wins, and then they get to set the rules. And the last time that happened was in 1945 because of the end of World War II. So at the end of World War II, the United States had 80% of the world's money. Gold was money then. It had half the world's economy. It had a dominant military power. And for that reason, because it was the dominant power, New York is where the United Nations is. Washington, D.C. is where the IMF and World Bank, they put it there because it was the American world order. The dollar was the world's reserve currency. And that always happens. Before that, at the end of World War I, there was the Treaty of Versailles, and the winners of the Treaty of Versailles determined how the system was going to work after that. And if you go back in history, repeatedly, there is always a world order, there is always happens this way, and it continues. Okay, so how does it work? You end up with that world order, and then you come through a period of peace and prosperity because nobody wants to fight the dominant world power. So that there's peace, and then in that period of time, wars are sort of great equalizers. They reduce wealth differences, wealth gaps, and so on. And then there's a rebuilding process, and that produces prosperity and peace. Also, nobody wants to go back into the war. Everybody remembers how horrible they are. Before that, these cycles typically can take 100 years. Let's say they could take a lifetime, and then people forget because they weren't the same people. They forget how terrible wars are. After wars, people remember how terrible wars are and they want peace. All of those reasons produces peace and prosperity, and there's also a financial reorganization. But then that peace and prosperity leads naturally to the country that has that having the world's reserve currency. A reserve currency means it's the currency that's accepted. So naturally, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Before that, it was the British pound during the British Empire. Before that, it was the Dutch guilder. It's the same pattern. And so there's peace and prosperity with the world's reserve currency. Now, when you have the world's reserve currency, the rest of the world wants to save, and they save in that currency. And that leads the country who has the world's reserve currency to borrow. It gives them what's called the exorbitant privilege of being able to borrow and print the world's currency. Boy, that's a good thing to have. And then what they do, of course, is as prosperity continues and asset prices go up, like stocks go up and everything does really well, it encourages more borrowing and spending and betting on prosperity. And that begins to have rise in levels of indebtedness. So you see debt levels rise. And the third thing it does is it creates greater wealth and values gaps. There become greater, naturally, the wealth that's built up is distributed unevenly. And those who make a lot of money then begin to have a larger wealth gap. And that creates also an opportunity gap. If we're lucky enough to have the money, we can educate our children well and so on. That gives them an unfair advantage in relationship to others. And so this wealth gap increases at the same time as levels of indebtedness increase. And then, of course, what happens is the competition increases. The competition increases because when you win and you have the other Germany or Japan or other countries destroyed after the war and there are no other competitors, then it's a dominant position. But over with time, others learn and begin to build up, like China particularly has increased its per capita income and its competitiveness. So China is a competitor with the United States, but all through that time, it was like the British were competitors with the Dutch and so on. So we see that pattern happen over and over. As that power gap narrows, then conflicts about how things should go increase. And internally, there is a conflict over wealth and wealth gaps. And then there's a higher level of indebtedness, which makes for a worse set of circumstances. And that combination of circumstances leads to more conflict and more problems. So traditionally, you see a lot of levels of debt. The classic way that you see this is, what does a government do when it doesn't have enough money? It's not like they go into the coffers. The coffers are empty. They have no gold. They have not that money. So where do they get the money? They have to take the money from somebody else. That's either through taxes, or what they do, people get angry when they're taking it away and there's a big fight over it. So what they usually do is they print money. And through the Roman times, back in Roman times, they had gold coins. They put less gold in the coins. They put other metals in the coins. And inevitably, they print money when they want to spend more. And that, of course, produces the inflation. It devalues the value of money, and you lose buying power. And when that happens, at the same time, there's a large wealth gap and opportunity gap. That produces a lot of internal conflict of the sort that we're seeing now. You always see populists of the left and populists of the right. What's a populist? A populist is a person who will fight for their side. They are not compromisers, okay? So you get to the point where there may not be compromise. For example, January 6th is right out of the populist playbook. In other words, fighting for power. It's entirely possible that we will see that neither side in the upcoming elections would accept losing, and there's a conflict. So you have that populace and that greater extreme of the left and the right. You have more internal conflict. And then as you have the rising power challenging the existing power, you have the world conflict. And then normally that produces a resolution, which happens through wars, because there's no world court that you bring your case to and then there's a jury and makes a decision. It's typically through conflict. You have the next war and you do the same thing over and over again. So that by and large is the pattern. When I was a kid, I caddied, I delivered newspapers, I did a bunch of jobs when I was a kid. At age 12, I bought my first stock. I was caddying, the stock market was hot at the time. People I caddied for were talking about it. The first stock I bought was a stock by the name of Northeast Airlines. The only criteria I had was that it was selling for less than $5 a share. I figured I could buy more shares, and if it went up, I'd go more money. That was dumb, but the company was about to go bankrupt. Another company acquired it. It tripled in value, and I was hooked on the markets. So I was hooked on the markets at the beginning of 12, and that's my game. Now, fast forward. At 22, 10 years later, so 1971, I was following the markets, and between graduating from college and going to graduate school, I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And in that intervening period, there was a lot of aspirations, a lot of desire to go to the moon, to eliminate poverty, to make equality in the United States, and so on. So in that early era, when there was Kennedy, and that made me an optimism, but during that 10 years, the fact is that there was a lot of borrowing of money, a lot of deficits. Back then, gold was money. And money as we know it was like checks in the checkbook that would go get you the gold. You could turn in your paper money for gold, but gold was the real money. And because the United States had borrowed a lot more money than it had, it wrote a lot more checks than it had gold in the bank. As President Nixon defaulted on the obligation to pay gold for the cash, he went on and he said, you won't get the gold. Of course, he didn't say it that way. He said it in a way where it sounded like there were speculators and so on, and he had to do it. And so on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, I thought the market was going to go down a lot because after all, this is a big crisis and the money as we know it ends. And I couldn't have been more wrong. It went up a lot. And what happened was I never went through a currency devaluation before, because in my lifetime, there was no currency devaluation. So that's the first time it happened. So I went back and I looked at history and I found the exact same thing happened on March 5th, 1933, except rather than the television and Nixon, it was the radio and Roosevelt, and he made the exact same announcement and had the exact same effect. And at that time, I learned two big things. I learned that first, many things that never happened in my lifetime seemed surprising at the time, and that I needed to study things that happened before my lifetime to understand them. So when certain things are happening, like right now, there are certain things that have never happened in our lifetime before, but happened many times in history. So in order to understand that, I need to understand the patterns, and even more than the patterns, the cause and effect relationships behind the patterns. So that mistake taught me that I needed to understand history. And each of the mistakes has taught me. I made a big mistake in 1982 when I calculated that American banks had lent more to foreign countries than those countries paid back. There was a big debt crisis. I anticipated this debt crisis, Mexico defaulting, great, okay. But what happened is the economy, and I expected there would be a terrible economic situation. And you know what happened? The Federal Reserve printed a lot of money and it had the same effect. You know, you learn the lessons, okay? Those lessons that I learned let me study the 1929 to 32 period, which allowed me to anticipate the 2008 financial crisis and make a lot of money there when most people lost money. And right now, what's happening now has led Bridgewater to make a lot of money while the markets are behaving badly now, because the same thing happened in the past. So studying history, learning the lessons, writing them down, modeling them. There's a template of what is happening. There's a story. We're now in an environment in which resources are allocated by political and ideological concerns or issues. In other words, we're not going to produce it wherever it's cheapest. And also because of worries that we might be in war, or that you could be in a war, every country wants self-sufficiency. And every country's worried, or every company is also worried, that they might be in a place where they are affected by politics. Think about it. The Nikes that you're buying, the Apples that you're buying, 22% of all manufactured goods imports come from China. And just imagine if the world said, we're against companies that are producing and operating in China, like Russia, let's say, if that was the case. That has an enormous economic effect, and companies today are considering, okay, where do I produce it? And it's not always produce it in the most cost-effective place. That adds to inflation too. And that's our new reality. Even like who gets the money in the system. In 2008, when they had the financial system, what the Federal Reserve did is it went in and it bought bonds. And when it buys bonds, it's buying bonds from those who sell bonds. And the bonds go up, and then those who are investors then take that money and they buy other financial assets. It does not trickle down to the population. It won't get the check to the person that needs to get the check. But in this last time, what they did is the government determined who's going to get the checks, because the federal government can determine that. So the Federal Reserve buys the debt of that, but the checks go where it's directed. So the ideological and non-economic forces, in a sense, but those that are being managed for a greater purpose, move that way. And that's, by the way, also very typical of wars. In all countries, they become a command economy. In other words, if I just left it to the profit system and people buying what they want to buy, it's not going to get the resource allocation a country needs in war. And so you're seeing both of those dynamics taking place in producing inflation.